What the EU carbon border tax is trying to do is to marginalize the continent's ability to export at a higher pace and also to be able to manufacture goods domestically for foreign or for international consumption. What does this mean in a very small way? It is a way of controlling movement of goods, particularly from the African continent, to try and say that there must be carbon tax imposed on goods that are going to be traded internationally from the African continent. Well, now, you said controversially that there are critics. Obviously, I am being one of them. I'm saying that, is it necessary the way that it's been introduced? Why is it that it didn't allow the timelines? And why is it not imposed to everybody, not just Africa, but also other trading areas in the international phase, including Asia and the Americas? And the simple answer that I can have is because some of the stuff that's been, or some of the imports that we have been getting from the European side are critical things that there's competition that has been introduced, and this will make it easier, therefore, to justify why they will not be able to consume some of the things that they've been taking from the African continent. That is as simple as that. Why is it urgent? There is no need for it to be urgent. Everybody understands transitioning to new technology, new energy capacity requires that there needs to be stricter regulatory frameworks to carbon emissions. But there's no need for it to happen within a space of less than a year post the pandemic, so that you can put more stringent measures for the continent to be able to trade on a free trade basis with the rest of the world.
Okay, so I'm going to stick with the Mozambique example because it's a heavy one. So carbon prices, which are often emissions trading schemes, many say, are still quite relatively rare in most of the world. And some believe that introducing them will be a major policy challenge for some lower income countries, Mozambique being an example. 54% of Mozambique's aluminum is exported to the EU per year for an estimated $1 billion a year in return. This comes to 7% of the country's gross domestic product, which is now at risk, Clive. So when we look at what this means, particularly for a country like Mozambique, what would this do to Mozambique if this policy, this mechanism was allowed to kick off the way it has right now been written and signed off on?
Very sound analysis there, my sister. So firstly, we know that if it's going to be affecting the original manufacturers, the equipment producers in the country in Mozambique. We also know that the industry employs close to about 12.5% of the total population of Mozambique. We also know that it will impact the extended jobs market. So, for example, logistics, for example, procurement, for example, manufacturing, and also at port level, which is at export level, there are indirect and direct consequences to the jobs market in that particular country. There's another additional aspect. If you increase any cost of production and without any mitigation circumstances, what that means is that it will create smaller markets, means that income will depreciate. And also what will happen, therefore, is that things will go much more expensive, meaning things like logistics, for example, to transport those goods, to get them to port, will be more expensive for the country to do so, meaning that it will affect the manufacturers themselves, who are going to have to now increase their cost to production so that they can get the goods to port. So there is a ripple effect that is created from that 7% or 7.5% of GDP that's been created. The question is, will they still be able to trade that $1 billion on an annual basis with this new additional cost? Can actually Mozambique, remember, they now have to change the way they do things. They now have to change the way they were producing. They now have to extend the way they were exporting. All those things are ripple effects that will be felt at the longer end by the consumer and also by the workers or the labor market in that particular country, which is really unfair, particularly at this time of the point in this point in time where the country is trying to actually recover from a recession suffered because of the pandemic.
So Mozambique is not the only African country primarily that would be affected. Egypt and Algeria are dominant in fertilizer exports to Europe, with some of the news this morning saying that Egypt has even overtaken Russian exports of fertilizer to the EU. Algeria is also the EU's fifth largest source of cement exports. What are we looking at in terms of Plan B, Plan C, Plan D? The European Union, 27 bloc country, is a massive market for any country. But if this is going to come into place and it's going to give us direct and indirect ripple effects at the end of the day, what are we doing to find alternatives?
I don't think we will have such severe impact. Yes, there will be, but my assumption or my analogy makes reference to the high demand of the product in the EU. It will still, with imposed taxes, still be a very lucrative business. The challenge here is fairness of trade. And you'll hear a lot of leaders, politicians actually, talk about fair trade amongst continent, countries, nations, whatever the case may be. In this instance, it seems there's a deliberate focus on products that come from the African continent. And I don't mean this in a bad way. I mean it really, or I'm trying to be controversial. I mean it really, because if you look at where the other fertilizers and so forth come in the EU, most of them outside of Egypt and outside of the other African countries come from within the EU region. Mm-hmm. It will be advantageous to them to then trade in that way, because then these things will not be imposed to them, but they seem to be imposed on the African continent as a whole. So it's unfair practice. It's unfair to the countries that are trading themselves. It is unfair to the people who are manufacturing, because that means that manufacturing costs will go up. But also, big point here. It is a big, huge wake-up call to South Africa, all the industrial countries on the African continent, to then look outside the border, and that's what you refer to as Plan B and Plan C. Mm. The first Plan B would be to be in sync and synchronizing businesses on the African continent, but also to make sure that the deals that we sign going forward are in support of our own manufacturing capacity and capability to be able to challenge price changes and carbon taxes that may come and be imposed to us unfairly so.
So then when we look at this, we've also done about a year plus of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Could that possibly be somewhat of a Plan C in this conversation? Could it be one of the solutions as you talk about being in sync and synchronizing business activities, even in line of these particular products on the African continent?
That's one of the Plan B and C's, my sister. So you're spot on. That's correct. That's what's required. But let me be honest with our continent. We've been very fair and exposed in terms of policy and structure of what we want to do, particularly when it comes to African free trade and the AU. But what we haven't done is implement that free trade cross-borderly, equally, without being unfair to the smaller countries that participate. We still have a very huge trade deficit between the African countries themselves. And that's what makes it a challenge. So if we can implement the free trade accordingly, we have a better opportunity, a better chance to become more competitive, and we might be able to fight off the likes of the scary euro when they try and make things very complicated and difficult for us.
So Clive, there's one point I would have thought you mentioned. I'm going to bring it up now, because when you trace this tax is imposed on exports that will be going to the EU, and that's of course exports on iron and steel, aluminum and things like that. And that tax that is imposed will end up staying where? Within the EU. It's going to stay with wealthier nations by imposing taxes on countries such as Egypt, Algeria, Mozambique, and the likes on the African continent. In it of itself, especially when we look at this climate justice and climate responsibility sort of conversation, given the fact that Africa's emissions will still not equal the EU's emissions for decades to come, what does that tell you?
You're asking a very controversial figure, I must tell you. But very true, very true. It will take a very long time to get to that point. And it is obviously deliberate But the liberation of it is very consequential to trading of the African countries that are relying on that type of line of business. But not only that, what we must be asking is, why is Africa being punished for things that have been happening in Asia and Europe for a long time? Why are we being punished for that when we contribute such little of consequence to the rest of the world's carbon emissions? So the answer to that is Africa must be punished first, because these guys are buying carbon credits. You remember, they're buying carbon credits as well. And so they want to use that as an advantage for them to continue industrialization of the Eurozone while still getting benefits for Africa to sell them the idea of carbon credits so that they can be able to continue to trade. So it's a very uneasy conversation to have. But here's my take, and this is just 2 points. We need to be sacrosanct. We need to agree to the terms and regulations that frame up the African topic on trade and how it's supposed to happen. We need to have better control of our own productivities and goods, and that's just not limited to aluminium, steel, and so forth, but also to things like cocoa, for example, things like beans, for example, which we are providing the world. And so therefore we need to be very strategic in which way we want to go forward. Lastly, my sister, which is very important, if we are in coalition, if we are in a relationship and collaboration, like you and I are today, we are wearing red, you know? So it shows that we can achieve more better as a unit on the African continent, and be able to be more competitive. We are not living back in 1950s where we were still under slavery and we were being colonized. We have to find new ways, and all bilateral agreements must be able to take first center stage the owners of the import, the owners of that product. Yes. And that's where the African continent plays a vital role, both in food security, energy consumption, and also in international trade.
So my final question, Clive, on this is, as you said, you're one of the critics, and others have even said that the EU's carbon border tax is actually in violation of the World Trade Organization's guidelines. And we've talked about a number of interesting trade disputes in the past 1 year as well. When you look at WTO guidelines and this situation, you've talked about African countries being in sync, possibly having the African Union come involved, but we're more likely to see individual countries approach the EU for some kind of allowance, some kind of sidelines permission. How do we come together collectively? And is it a conversation? Do you think this is something that should make it to the table of the WTO before it comes into force on October the 1st, 2023?
Well, I'm not a legal expert, but I know that if you want to challenge something, you need to use, obviously, the courts. There are ways in which individual countries can raise these opposing ideas. We have the World Trade Organization, which you can always appeal. We know South Africa did it for the first time this year with the citrus sector. There are platforms like that. Unfortunately, the World Trade Organization, not necessarily a great place to argue this, because they haven't done anything really to contribute towards making Africa more aggressive or more potent in actually exporting its goods to the rest of the world. But the steps that need to be taken, I agree with you that individual countries must be able, for example, like Egypt, to appeal. Also, we need to find out what is it that we are doing at the G20. Having South Africa as a representative there, can that contribute towards how we do trade? What is the role of the World Economic Forum, the likes of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund? Because some of these countries that we're talking about are, in actual fact, in relationship and partnerships with these organizations. We need to step up and put our voices out there. They need to know that they cannot just impose things and we just turn our backs over and accept it. So I think you're right. There needs to be some kind of conversation had. But the African Union is a very vital organization where these conversations should be taking place as a collective to be able to make sure that we can have our voice heard at the international level.
All right, Clive, I do think we're going to see a few more changes or reviews and developments with this conversation over the coming few months before it goes into effect on October the 1st. And unfortunately, probably a few more trade conversations and disputes that we'll also be bringing you in for. But thank you so much for joining me today, and Merry Christmas in advance.
Thank you very much and have a fantastic 2023. I look forward to seeing you and your team as well. You're doing a great job and I enjoy being on this platform.
Thank you so much, Clive. And unfortunately, in this situation, what we know is that the EU says that the policy is meant to help reduce carbon leakage. Now, carbon leakage is what we call it when a company decides to move their production to a less regulated country so that they can keep their production costs low. But the EU is coming under heavy criticism, and many saying that this is in fact going to harm African exporters of these particular products to the EU, and in the end, make it much more harder for those countries themselves to cut emissions. October 1st, 2023 is the date that this is meant to become applicable. We'll see what happens between now and then. And this is it for us on Business Edge today. Please follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. You can also head to our website, www.newscentral.africa, and download our mobile app on the Play Store and App Store. From my team and those behind the scenes who make Business Edge possible for you and yours across the continent Monday through Friday, I'm wishing you, your loved ones, your family and friends a very, very Merry Christmas. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Have a fantastic Christmas-filled weekend.